everyone, my name is Chris Dickey. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the tuba-euphonium teacher at Washington State University in the United States. Today's VTech presentation is Establishing Identity, LGBTQ plus affirming strategies for studios and classrooms. Today, I'll be talking about the ways in which studio teachers, ensemble directors, and other classroom teachers can create more affirming spaces for students who identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. Some of this discussion today might contain ideas that are new to you, and that's perfectly fine. Do what you can when you can. When I was younger and growing up gay in a conservative part of Illinois in the middle part of the United States, I experienced bullying, belittling. I was made to feel othered or less than. And unfortunately, there were times when I feared for my own personal safety and well-being. Now, I'm thrilled to see the world embracing a changed view on LGBTQ plus individuals. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I'd love to have a world full of allies, people who love and support people for who they truly are. Allies encourage those around them to be an authentic version of themselves. So, shall we make a start? A little bit of background for you. Notions about sexuality and gender identity expression, and then later understandings about what all of those terms mean, those actually stem from the 19th century. Because before that, humans didn't have the language or the labels that we have now. In the 19th century is when we start to see this othering of people, meaning people who were deemed problematic or different were viewed as deviants if they didn't fit into this heteronormative mold. We can be very quick to come up with categories or labelings and othering people. This actually stems from the 19th century. The French philosopher Michel Foucault, who lived from 1926 to 1984, wrote a lot about this, the history of sexuality. And that's where it comes from, the 19th century. It's around that time where we start to see hate and fear directed at the LGBTQ plus community. Hatred and fear can often be directed at that which is not easily understood or embraced. Lastly, you're going to hear me use the term queer occasionally. I use the term queer actually to communicate this broad array of gender identities and sexual orientations. Now, queer has historically been used as a pejorative term, meant to inflict pain on someone in the LGBTQ plus community, implying that they're somehow abnormal, different, or on the fringe of society. The term queer was actually reclaimed after the 1969 Stonewall riots, and it now serves as a way of empowering members of the LGBTQ community. So I've talked about being an ally. Why be an ally? Why is this work important? I'm reminded of this lovely Maya Angelou quote: "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." Or there's a Japanese proverb that goes a little bit like, "The nail that sticks out will be hammered in." I think people ought to be authentic, representing their true selves to the world without fear of judgment or hate. Subtly implying people have to conform to social norms tells those who are different, you don't belong. You don't have a space here. You don't have as much value as these other people. So being an ally is very important work. I think we'll have some terms first. So terms to know when talking about the LGBTQ plus community. So that acronym, LGBTQ plus, it's an all-encompassing term. It tells us a lot. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and then a whole host of other marginalized gender identities and sexual orientations. It's just a tidy way of encapsulating a lot of contrasting identities. When we use the terms gender identity or expression, that is related to one's inner idea of what it means to be a man or a woman. Both. A blend of both, or maybe neither one. Gender expression, related, is how a person outwardly or publicly presents their gender. This can include things like behavior and outward appearance. Outward appearance, things like dress, hair, makeup, maybe body language, and even voice. A person's chosen name and pronouns are also common ways of expressing gender. More on that later. Others perceive a person's gender through a lot of the attributes I just described. So it's important to know what gender identity and expression can be. The term cisgender is when a person identifies with the biological sex assigned to them at birth, which contrasts with the term transgender. This is a person for whom their gender identity or expression is different from all those cultural expectations placed upon them based on the sex they were assigned at birth. So LGBTQ+, broad term, and then the terms gender identity, expression, cisgender, and transgender, very helpful to know what those mean as you navigate working with people. How can we begin to affirm LGBTQ+ students? What we have coming your way now is a list of suggestions, suggested behaviors or ways of thinking. The first one we addressed. Know some general terms. Ask if you don't know something or if you don't know what something means. We are fortunate to live in a time where we have many reliable online resources. We also have friends and members of the community with lived experiences who could be very helpful and informative. In seeking more knowledge, we have ways of getting that knowledge, thankfully. Another bit, especially if you're a teacher, consider outreach before the teaching starts. Really, a quick welcome to the studio message can go a long way. When you send out that welcome message to your students, in that message, you can let students know that you're thinking about respecting their identities, names, and pronouns. For example, if you use a different name, please let me know. This is a small yet subtle way to promote inclusion. You could also ask for pronouns and names at that point, just in case it differs from what you have on the roster. Again, small, subtle ways to promote inclusion that really say a lot to your students who are receiving that message. But before I go on, what's all this talk about pronouns? Why do pronouns matter? Why do we have this discussion? To boil it all down, small things are actually big things. In English and in other languages, whether we realize it or not, people often refer to us using pronouns when speaking about us. When speaking of a single person in the third person, these pronouns can have a gender implied, such as, he referring to a man or a boy, or she referring to a woman or a girl. These associations aren't always helpful, nor are they always accurate. Many times people make assumptions about the gender of another person based on the person's appearance or name. Again, these assumptions aren't always correct. And the act of making an assumption, even if correct, could send a potentially harmful message that people have to look a certain way to demonstrate the gender that they are or are not. Using someone's correct personal programs, again, it's a way to respect them and create a more inclusive environment, just as using a person's name can be a way to respect them. It can be viewed as slightly offensive or harassing to make up a nickname for someone and then call them that nickname against their will. Well, it can be extended and viewed differently. It can be offensive or harassing to guess at someone's pronouns and refer to them using pronouns if that's not how the person wants to be known. Or even worse, Actively choosing to ignore the pronouns someone has stated they go by could be a rather oppressive notion that that doesn't exist. You don't matter. I don't have time. I can't be bothered to do this for you. It can say a lot. So let's keep going with another thing you could consider is examining syllabi and concert programs. Long story short, seeing is believing. Or as the educator Marion Wright Edelman said, it's hard to be what you can't see. When people see themselves in what they do, it demonstrates they too have a place or a seat at the table. We can step back and ask ourselves, what voices are being taught and heard? Is anyone missing? Is there something I can do to be more inclusive of LGBTQ plus individuals? When we look at things like syllabi and email signatures, we could consider including pronouns in those spaces. Again, small, easy, subtle way to show inclusion for LGBTQ plus people. Concert programs. Can LGBTQ plus composers be incorporated into recital repertoire? The short answer is yes, of course. But just like including other marginalized voices, women, people of color, to name a few, it takes some thought and work. Can you have LGBTQ plus representation in your list of guest speakers or invited masterclass teachers? Again, the answer is yes, of course, but it takes that concerted effort. It takes an extra step. Every other fall, I teach a seminar class on tuba-euphonium literature, and one of our first discussions, once we get the ball rolling, is, hey, everyone, name the classics for tuba and euphonium. People quickly jot down Vaughan Williams, Gregson, Horowitz, Cosma, the list goes on. Great. We then step back and I say, hey, is there anyone missing? Who has been left out of this list? And that's where we have this light bulb moment or an aha. It can be very informative. I suggest maybe a similar practice for you. Examine, your past concert programs. Examine list of invited teachers, masterclass teachers. It can be very illuminating. Remember, music does not appear on a recital program without some type of decision being made. The same goes for guest lecturers and invited masterclass teachers. We're all the gatekeepers here, y'all. We're the gatekeepers here. So we call the shots. We're making the decisions. And long story short, the answer is yes, we can have more inclusion of LGBTQ plus voices. It just takes the extra step. It takes the extra concerted effort to make it happen. Next, look for and listen to in order to honor the student's identities. This can be really hard work. We can never assume that someone who differs from our notion of gender or gender identity is LGBTQ+. It's always best, let that student self-identify to you. Because this type of work is, dealing with people, it's complex, it's always best to be flexible and adapt when necessary. These things are constantly evolving and changing because humans are constantly evolving and changing. I suggest we have to continue to learn. Though I am a proud member and advocate of the LGBTQ plus community, I have to keep updated. We're learning new things all the time about how to navigate these tricky conversations about identity. If it were easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, yet here we are. Seek resources to stay informed, but while seeking resources, and if we're going to specific people in mind that we know, keep in the back of your mind, avoid placing excessive emotional labor on the LGBTQ plus person sometimes this has happened to me. Hey, Chris, you're queer. Can you come speak to so-and-so about topics A, B, and C? Okay, there's a time and place for this. Yes, I'm an LGBTQ plus person. I have a lot of lived experiences. I can speak with authority on a variety of subjects, but that might not necessarily be the case for every LGBTQ plus person you know. A side story, I was once asked to talk to a prospective student and their family because this student had two moms. The people in charge of that event, who I think learned a very valuable lesson that day, approached me and they said, well, because I was at the time I was the only queer faculty member in on the music faculty here. Chris, could you speak to this family? You know, they're an alternative lifestyle couple, and we think you could really answer their questions. Well, we're a typical university, and we don't have, you know, gay meal plans or queer parking options. It's the same for everyone. I know what the person's intent was in asking me to speak to these people, but the frame, their view was, oh well, this family has queer people in it. Only the queer person can talk to them. Not necessarily accurate, but again, those people learned a little valuable lesson that day. Let's just avoid placing excessive emotional labor on queer people that you know. Next, mistakes are inevitable. They're going to happen. Say, I'm sorry. Learn and move on. Thank you. I'll do better. Apologies are normal. They're commonplace. You know, the Maya Angelou quote, when we know better, we do better, right? Because we're all human, mistakes are bound to happen. This stuff is messy. We just learn from that particular mistake and then we move on. That's the best route to go. Dwelling on it draws even more negative attention to whatever experience you might have in trying to be more LGBTQ plus inclusive. We just move on. And in the interest of time and just interacting with people, if we learn and move on, it just makes it better for everyone involved. So embrace mistakes will happen. It's what we do to learn from those mistakes that says more. Consider using thoughtful, inclusive language. Again, this can be quite tricky. Gender-inclusive terminology is just difficult. We could do an informal poll right now to those listening. How many of you have ever said phrases like, hey, you guys, or speaking about students broadly, you say, he will take his pencil and write blah, blah, blah. We insert gender into our language very often in English and, of course, in many other languages. Using gender-inclusive language takes practice, but I'm a big believer that it can happen. A couple of very quick examples. Consider using the term partner instead of boyfriend or girlfriend. If you're talking about someone's, a group of people, maybe you can say y'all or everyone, or just refer to students instead of, hey, you guys. Hey, you guys. You know, we're removing gender from the equation there. And then lastly, this is a quick one. Instead of always referring to the interchangeable his, her, just swap it out with their. Everyone take their horns and get up on the recital stage. Instead of everyone take his or her instrument and get up on the recital stage. Just say there. It's shorter, it's sweet, it's to the point, and it includes everyone. It's not gendered in any way. Just say there. My next bit of advice would be to be explicit. Have a conversation with yourself about what are your values, and then don't be afraid to share them with those around you. Let your values be known. Call out anti-LGBTQ plus language or behaviors when you see or hear them in your particular environment. Never assume students or colleagues know where you stand. With these types of issues, it's best to just be explicit. Let it be known. The culture of any given tuba-euphonium studio can be one marked by fierce competition, warm and supportive mentalities, or maybe some type of middle ground. What remains important is to actively choose what kind of culture you want and then adhere to that decision. Make your decision about a culture well known to your students. Be explicit. We don't necessarily have to devote hours and hours to talking about the significance of positive attitudes and their impact on studio climate. But sometimes just an outright statement coming from the teacher carries true weight or more weight with the students. Tuba-euphonium studios can be sources of inspiration, places where students shape and strengthen a work ethic. Additionally, studios are where communities are built and then sustained throughout a person's career. It's a learning community, like a studio, where students can address issues, learn, work through problems, seek help, and create, of course, lasting relationships with their peers. I'll bet if you were to take 5 minutes to outline the values and behaviors that you believe are really essential to building a positive, inclusive, affirming studio culture, I think you could come up with a list of traits and actions that you could then monitor on a regular basis. You will know if your efforts are producing results simply by asking your students directly. How is this going? Let me know. What ways can we be better? Very informative stuff. So really, we're all works in progress. The work goes on. I'm guided by this list of 3 L's. We need to listen. We need to learn. And we need to continue to lift up those who need lifting up marginalized voices, people who have been, for one reason or another, not a part of the conversation. Teaching is a demanding yet highly rewarding activity. It could require constant tweaking and small adjustments along the way, all of which are necessary to teach the diverse students who walk through your door. To be inclusive and affirming tells us to respond to these learners by acknowledging and valuing who they truly are, their authentic versions of themselves, and what varied experiences they bring to the world. There is a lot of individual work to be done, myself included. We can keep learning about social identities, equity, privilege, all while we work toward creating more socially responsive learning environments all around us. Perhaps a teacher might need to brush up on language associated with the LGBTQ plus community. Or maybe it's time to have a good, long inner dialogue about notions of representation of LGBTQ plus people, or inclusive concert programming. Regardless, teachers inevitably serve as role models for their students. And we have this opportunity to model, yes, good tuba-euphonium playing, but also social awareness. We can show students that we consider their many contrasting perspectives as this source of knowledge and creativity with what we're doing in music. For a teacher, everything we do and say can matter. Inclusive pedagogy, while it's this complex issue worthy of a much broader and longer conversation, if I'm being honest, this will matter to our students, both the current and student and future ones. We're all works in progress. I've said that a couple times. Since there's no one approach to inclusive pedagogy or this clever, never fail, step-by-step guide for being LGBTQ plus affirming, we can practice being inclusive with our pedagogy just as we practice our long tones, scales, and arpeggios. So thank you very much for listening today. I appreciate your time. My email address here, chris.dickey@wsu.edu, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. If you have follow-up questions or would love to have another conversation, I'm more than happy to be a resource for you here. But again, thank you very much for listening to this presentation on LGBTQ plus affirming strategies for teachers. And if nothing else from today's lecture, just remember that this is an ongoing thing. And when we know better, we can do better. Thank you.